The 7 most racist guests Johnny Carson ever had. For 30 years, Johnny Carson reigned as television's undisputed king of late night, welcoming America's biggest stars into living rooms across the nation with trademark charm, quick wit, and a seemingly effortless interview style. From behind his NBC desk, Carson created a cultural touchstone that defined American entertainment for a generation. A show where celebrities let their guards down and revealed more authentic versions of themselves than anywhere else on television. But that unguarded authenticity sometimes revealed uncomfortable truths about America's most beloved stars, especially as the country's attitudes toward race evolved dramatically during Carson's 3-decade tenure. The Tonight Show's extended format and relaxed atmosphere occasionally exposed prejudices that more tightly controlled television appearances kept hidden, creating a historical record of casual racism that many fans have conveniently forgotten. Carson was caught between worlds, said Margaret Collins, a noted television historian. He couldn't very well cancel every star who had problematic racial attitudes. That would have eliminated half of Hollywood's biggest names in the 60s and 70s. But the archival footage shows him, over time, growing increasingly uncomfortable with certain guests, creating subtle yet noticeable shifts in the way he handled their appearances. Today, we're looking at 7 of Johnny Carson's most racially problematic guests, entertainment legends whose Tonight Show appearances exposed prejudices that contradict their polished public images. Their moments on Carson's couch expose not just the biases of their era, but also how America's understanding of racism evolved during the formative decades of television. First, John Wayne. America's cowboy John Wayne came closer to personifying American mythology than perhaps any other figure. His rough film persona celebrated frontier justice, aggressive masculinity, and unyielding patriotism. For many years, one of Hollywood's most bankable stars, Wayne represented an ideal of Americanness that captured the hearts of millions of movie watchers. His Tonight Show appearances usually celebrated this carefully managed image, as Carson treated him with the respect given to a living legend. But behind Wayne's iconic screen presence lay political and racial views that clashed with the more inclusive ideals that were gaining traction during Carson's tenure. Those views burst into public consciousness with a notorious 1971 Playboy interview, in which Wayne expressed sentiments that went far beyond conservative politics and into overtly racist territory. Entertainment journalist Thomas Henderson referenced the most infamous quote from that interview, in which Wayne said he believed in white supremacy until black Americans were educated to a point of responsibility. This was not some sort of ambiguous comment or something that could be written off as a misunderstanding. It was a clear endorsement of racist ideology from one of America's most celebrated stars. Other statements were even more disturbing, such as Wayne's support of European colonizers who took Native American land and his rejection of the idea of systemic racism in Hollywood. All these comments ran against Wayne's public persona of fairness and just behavior. Henderson added that Carson had gotten to interview Wayne before and after the Playboy interview came out, raising the question of how Carson handled having a guest whose views on racism had become so widely public. Archival footage of Wayne's Tonight Show appearances reveals subtle shifts in Carson's demeanor after the interview. He was still polite and professional, but his body language and conversational tone became more constrained. The easy camaraderie of earlier interviews gave way to a slightly cooler, more formal dynamic that attentive viewers could sense. As television historian Margaret Collins noted, even though Wayne never uttered anything overtly racist on the air, knowledge of what he had said hung over their later interactions. Carson did not confront Wayne directly. That was not his style, at least with older stars he admired. But the tone unmistakably changed, and the warmth that once characterized their conversations drained away. It was Carson's approach to Wayne that reflected the broader balancing act he perpetuated throughout his career. He acknowledged shifting social standards without publicly challenging Hollywood icons. Without banning him or openly attacking him, Carson established emotional distance while offering professional courtesies. By doing so, he could acknowledge the tension without making it the center of the show. These appearances on The Tonight Show epitomize a growing challenge in evaluating historical figures with public legacies that run alongside documented racist views. They press audiences to balance his massive, undeniable cultural influence with the damaging beliefs he proudly supported. Carson never resolved the contradiction fully, but his quiet shift in demeanor offered a subtle acknowledgement of the discomfort created by the comments of Wayne. Number 2. Bob Hope. When the comedy legend Bob Hope appeared on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, he represented the establishment of American humor. He was a living bridge from vaudeville and early radio to the USO performances that made him beloved across generations. His patriotic credentials, tireless tours entertaining American troops, and grandfatherly public image earned him a special place in American culture, one that often shielded him from scrutiny over the racist elements that marked much of his early work. According to entertainment historian Robert Thompson, Hope had a long history of racist jokes, blackface routines, and caricatured Chinese accents during the early decades of his career. He rose to fame at a time when these forms of humor were considered normal in mainstream entertainment. Like many comics of his generation, he built parts of his success on stereotypes that would be completely unacceptable today. Unlike some performers who later recognized that older material was racist, Hope resisted the changed cultural norms related to race. Confronted by criticism about the racism in his earlier humor, he generally spoke dismissively of such criticism rather than reflecting on the harm it caused. According to Thompson, Hope would not apologize for older routines, but felt that they were products of their times. The attitude is one shared by many older entertainers who believed that this new racial sensitivity was no more than political correctness gone awry and had little to do with valid criticism of hurtful stereotypes. More disturbing, though, was Hope's continuing reliance on racist jokes well into the era when mainstream comedy was beginning to turn away from that kind of material. While he softened the most overtly racist elements of his early work, he continued to depend on ethnic stereotypes in televised celebrity roasts, public appearances, and even in some of his Tonight Show interviews. A former NBC executive remembers that as late as the 1970s and 80s, Hope would sometimes slip a racist joke or two into his Tonight Show appearances. Usually, Carson would reply with a tight smile or change the subject rather than play along with the joke. For those watching closely, such tiny reactions betrayed his unease. Carson had an especially hard time with Hope's appearances due to the status of the older comedian as an icon, and due to his respect for the man's contributions to entertainment. Without approaching Hope about the racial attitudes of his humor being outdated, Carson used subtle ways to change the subject. He remained professional while signaling, very quietly, that old jokes no longer fit the cultural moment. As one onlooker remembered, Johnny smiled, but he knew the old jokes weren't funny anymore. His tight smiles and topic changes caught him in a complex balance, honoring a legendary figure while silently recognizing that parts of Hope's comedy had become injurious and inappropriate. Number 3. Charlton Heston was a Hollywood conservative, finding his place within American culture during his appearances on The Tonight Show. During his career, he made films that range from biblical epics, such as The Ten Commandments and Ben-Hur, to science fiction movies like Planet of the Apes and Soylent Green. His resonant voice and physically imposing frame made him one of the more instantly identifiable actors of his generation. As he grew older and more politically vocal, his public persona became inextricably linked to conservative activism, including issues that intersected with race. H's political involvement grew more intense with his association with the National Rifle Association, through which he came to be their president. His rhetoric grew to represent, during this time, positions that many of his critics saw as dismissive of the civil rights movements and structural racism. According to political analyst Jennifer Washington, H often positioned civil rights activists as complainers, framing racism as an issue from a bygone era, rather than one endemic in current structures. These positions made the guest appearances of Carson's later years much more difficult to navigate. Carson made adjustments in his approach toward H as the latter's political identity came increasingly to the fore in his public image. He was courteous to him, as he was with his other guests, but he and his writers took more control of the conversations to keep them light and innocuous. One former writer for The Tonight Show remembers that Carson would quietly order the preparation of nostalgic film clips and innocuous anecdotes whenever H was booked. Johnny knew H was increasingly likely to steer conversations toward his political opinions, some of which included racial perspectives that might alienate viewers. Carson's goal was to keep the show entertaining and avoid turning it into a political battleground. Backstage, however, H's remarks were occasionally far cruder. Washington said that off-camera, he sometimes made disparaging remarks about civil rights leaders, and a number of those remarks crossed the line into racially stereotyped comments. The production staff were concerned about these private remarks because they were in such contrast to the dignified authority he could command on camera. Those views seldom broke the surface directly in his Tonight Show interviews, but knowledge of them kept Carson's manner with the actor increasingly cautious, polite but clearly restrained. Carson's reaction to H was about what one might have predicted given his usual approach to guests whose ideas were worrisome. He didn't want an outright confrontation, nor did he want to provide them with a soapbox. He guided H onto safer topics and remained affable without being particularly warm. The exchange itself demonstrated the contradiction inherent in the public persona of H. As one onlooker commented, he could play Moses, but he kept half the cast in Egypt. There was something jarring about the heroic freedom-fighting characters he played on screen when set against his occasional high-handed dismissiveness about modern struggles for civil rights. Number 4. Don Rickles. The insult comic Don Rickles presented one of the most complicated challenges for Johnny Carson when it came to racial sensitivity. Rickles built his entire comedic persona around insult humor, much of it aimed directly at racial and ethnic identities. Known, ironically, as Mr. Warmth, he developed a style that ignored virtually every emerging rule of racial awareness. Comedy historian Michael Barnes noted that Rickles' routines often targeted Black, Asian, and Jewish guests with a level of abrasiveness that few other performers could get away with. While Rickles insulted everyone, his material consistently relied on racial stereotypes that would have been considered unacceptable coming from almost any other comedian. His use of racial slurs and exaggerated caricatures went far beyond the boundaries of what most entertainers dared to attempt, even during less politically sensitive decades. One of the most notorious examples came from a stage encounter in which he referred to Sammy Davis Jr. with a racial slur. Barnes made it clear that this was not an isolated incident. Rickles consistently employed explicit racial slurs throughout his career. What made his case unusual was the peculiar acceptance he received on occasion from the very communities he insulted. Performers like Sammy Davis Jr. openly maintained friendships with Rickles, further muddling the task of labeling his humor as purely malicious. It was within this unique context that Rickles could occupy a space in which many felt his offensive material was somehow exempt from normal standards, even as society's understanding of racism evolved. Adding a level of difficulty to the challenge was Carson's personal relationship with Rickles. Unlike most other guests, whom he kept at arm's length, Rickles was somebody Carson truly liked and considered a friend. This put Carson in a complicated position, torn between his affection for Rickles and his awareness of how unacceptable some of the comedian's material had become on modern television. According to a member of the former Tonight Show staff, Carson once quietly signaled producers that if Rickles used a particular racial slur again during a taping, they'd immediately cut to commercial. The moment reflected the dilemma in which Carson frequently found himself. He admired Rickles' comedic fearlessness, yet understood that entertainment standards were shifting and certain jokes could no longer be allowed. Ultimately, Carson dealt with Rickles by giving him more latitude than most guests received, but still imposing invisible boundaries that were not to be crossed. This created a situation where Rickles often pushed racial lines, but rarely went so far that Carson had to intervene on air. Yet this leeway also revealed a regular inconsistency in how television dealt with racism during the era. Defenders for Rickles argued that he mocked everybody equally and forged friendships with many of those he insulted. Critics countered that regardless of intention, His jokes reinforced negative stereotypes and contributed to broader cultural harm. As one observer put it, Rickles said it was comedy, but it punched down more than it punched up. Even though he targeted everybody, his harshest material often landed on marginalized groups, and his jokes most commonly reinforced social hierarchies rather than appending them. Number 5. Burt Reynolds. The charming rogue Burt Reynolds came to embody a brand of Southern masculinity that defined much of American entertainment in the 1970s and early 1980s. With his mischievous grin and relaxed confidence, he became one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. When Tonight Show appearances showcased his playful, self-deprecating personality, Carson obviously enjoyed the lively interactions. But beneath this affable persona, Reynolds occasionally revealed racial attitudes shaped by his upbringing in Florida during the era of segregation. Entertainment journalist Rebecca Santos noted that Reynolds had made several racially charged jokes during the 1970s and early 1980s, reflections of lingering influences from his past. Unlike the more sustained patterns of racial insensitivity exhibited by many of its guests, Reynolds's problematic comments generally seem to come as isolated lapses rather than a defining characteristic of his public behavior. They were still significant, however, insofar as they took place on a platform as big as The Tonight Show. Perhaps most infamous was the segment from 1978 in which Reynolds made light of Native Americans in ways that played on old stereotypes and marginalized their historical experiences. He got a rather immediate response for the time. Hundreds of viewers wrote complaints to NBC regarding the segment, a remarkable response at a time when issuing any sort of feedback required far more effort than simply posting online. Carson's reaction to the exchange revealed how sensitive he had become to matters of race and how certain material could no longer be tolerated. Without reprimanding Reynolds on the air or scolding him publicly, Carson quietly pulled the segment from rerun packages. The footage stayed off the air for years, according to a former NBC executive. The move, which took place behind the scenes, acknowledged the material was inappropriate without allowing Reynolds to feel personally embarrassed or maligned. It also reinforced how Carson preferred to deal with racial controversies through programming decisions and subtle course correction rather than public confrontation. Reynolds' case is perhaps unique because his periodic racial insensitivity didn't square with his wider public persona, which generally conveyed warmth and inclusivity. Unlike comedians whose racism was part of their comedic personas, Reynolds' problematic comments seemed more like vestiges of his upbringing than incitements. One onlooker referred to him as the heartthrob until he opened his mouth, which captured well how jarring it was whenever his charm conflicted with a thoughtless comment. Number 6. Red Skelton. The comic veteran Red Skelton represented an earlier era of American entertainment when he appeared on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. He was a direct link to vaudeville, radio, and the earliest years of television comedy. The legendary status and multidimensional work he had built up in forms of entertainment gave him widespread respect, including from Carson himself, who had grown up watching Skelton's performances and clearly viewed him as a foundational figure in American comedy. This deep respect, though, created challenges for Carson as he tried to navigate the growing divide between the racial sensibilities of Skelton's formative era and later decade standards. Skelton had begun his career at a time when blackface and racial caricature were not fringe practices, but rather mainstream components of American entertainment. Those traditions formed his approach to comedy, and he had participated in them extensively during his early career. According to entertainment historian Robert Thompson, Skelton's early work included routine use of blackface and racial caricature, not as occasional misjudgments, but rather as a standard part of the comedic landscape that he had inherited. Unlike some performers who over time distanced themselves from such material or decried its hurtful impact as social awareness changed, Skelton was notably defensive about shifting standards of racial sensitivity. When asked about his past performances or the shifting understanding of racist entertainment, he generally resisted any suggestion that these concerns were legitimate. Instead, he often framed such criticism as unnecessary censorship of traditional comedy. Thompson also observed that Skelton was indeed one of those who defended minstrel-style humor well into the 1980s. During interviews, including appearances on The Tonight Show, he sometimes expressed frustration with what he perceived as increasing constraints placed on comedians. Without recognizing the harm that racial caricatures can cause, Skelton presented concerns about stereotypes as assaults on comedy itself. This view went beyond the defense of his own back catalog. He publicly deplored the increasing racial sensitivity of the entertainment industry and cast himself as a guardian of comedic tradition against what he saw as the scourge of political correctness. A former NBC executive remembered that on The Tonight Show, in the 1970s and 1980s, Skelton would sometimes grumble about network standards that forbade the kind of racial humor that had been a staple of his career. The comments often left Carson in an uncomfortable position. While Carson had enormous respect for Skelton's influence on comedy, he knew that many of Skelton's attitudes had become increasingly incompatible with his audience. Carson dealt with such moments with his characteristic finesse, nodding respectfully toward Skelton's stature while avoiding most of the more questionable comments. Without confronting Skelton, Carson would respond to him coolly before turning the conversation to other less contentious aspects of Skelton's career. Number 7. Buddy Hackett. The unapologetic throwback, Buddy Hackett, presented a different but equally complex challenge for Carson. Hackett was a comedian whose style remained firmly rooted in an earlier era of American entertainment despite rapidly evolving standards around him. With his expressive face, distinctive voice, and willingness to push boundaries with risque material, Hackett forged a successful career across nightclubs, films, and television. Yet, racial humor remained a consistent element in his comedic identity. Comedy historian Michael Barnes said that Hackett frequently told racist jokes both on and off the air. Hackett never mellowed his material like performers who did over time. He used the same stereotypes, ethnic accents, and racially targeted jokes that he had relied on since the beginning of his career. This made him an increasingly uncomfortable guest on The Tonight Show as American awareness of racial sensitivity developed. What made Hackett different from other problematic guests was the defiant, deliberate nature of his racial material. Where some entertainers slipped into outdated remarks because they were used to a different time, Hackett embraced these jokes wholeheartedly as an aspect of who he was as a comedian, refusing to change as the world did around him. Barnes added that Hackett had been known among fellow comics as the man who never stopped telling World War II-era slurs. Most comedians of his generation gradually updated their material as norms shifted, but Hackett remained anchored to an earlier comedic framework. To younger comedians, his approach increasingly seemed harmful and out of place within a changing entertainment landscape. How Carson dealt with Hackett reflected one of the tightropes he walked throughout his career, honoring comedy's history and yet placating changing social mores. Carson neither blacklisted Hackett nor gave him full license on the program. He instituted guidelines that tightened as the times did. According to one former Tonight Show staffer, when in the mid-1970s, a routine inspired an avalanche of viewer protests, Carson laid down the extraordinary edict explicitly forbidding Hackett to do certain routines. This more direct intervention signaled how exceptional Hackett's resistance had become. Even then, Carson avoided public confrontation. He continued to allow Hackett to appear, but required him to eliminate his most offensive material. This approach reflected Carson's broader method of maintaining ties to comedy's past, while adapting to new ethical standards. Hackett represented a performer who had belonged to a different time and refused to leave it. His comedic identity was inextricably tied to racial stereotyping. Meaningful adaptation would have required a complete reinvention rather than minor adjustments. Carson's negotiation of these cultural tensions contradictory, as it inevitably represents the transitional quality of American television in the latter half of the 20th century. The Tonight Show, under his guidance, neither fully confronted nor ignored the racial issues at the heart of entertainment history, but occupied instead the ambiguous middle ground that defined so much mainstream television during a period of great but incomplete social change.